the Supreme Court. There's a sense of sanctity to this place, the place where our Constitution is upheld. Laws are judged here on the basis of their constitutionality. These 9 judges rule on the cases, and their rulings are law. And that's what we're talking about in this episode, the law, specifically the moral law. In this episode, you're the judge. Hi, welcome to Equip 412. I'm Bill Vennard. I feel like I should be talking in hushed tones or something. You decide if this argument, the moral argument, along with the other 2 arguments that we've looked at so far, the cosmological argument and the fine-tuning argument, provide enough circumstantial evidence to answer the question at hand. Is there anyone out there? Does God exist? Let's get started. Is there anyone out there? The moral argument, or sometimes known as the moral law argument. Is the existence of morality evidence for God's existence? How many of you have ever heard this? That's not fair. Well, as a parent of 4 kids and now a grandparent, I've heard that many times. If you're a parent and have heard that before, how many times have you said this? Life's not fair, get over it. Even if you're not a parent, I'm pretty sure you've probably heard those statements before. I honestly don't recall sitting down and teaching my children a specific lesson on fairness. Okay, kids, today it's Tuesday and we're going to talk about fairness and why it's important to be fair. I don't recall doing that. But over the years, I taught them many lessons, but I honestly don't recall specific lessons about fairness. But when you hear children say that, young children, when you hear them say that, do you ever wonder where that sense of fairness or unfairness comes from? Is the existence of morality evidence for God's existence? The moral argument begins with the fact that all people recognize some moral code, that some things are right and some things are wrong. We've seen that even the most remote tribes who have been cut off from the rest of civilization observe a moral code similar to everyone else's. Although differences certainly exist in some areas, there seem to be some things that are universal, seems to be a thread that runs through all different types of cultures. Where does that come from? When we say that a moral law exists, we mean that all people are impressed with a basic sense of right and wrong. C.S. Lewis wrote in Mere Christianity, think of a country where people were admired for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who had been the kindest to him. You might just as well try to imagine a country where 2 and 2 made 5. What he's saying is clear. There are basic principles of right and wrong that everyone understands. We know that it is wrong to kill innocent people. We know it's wrong to torture infants for fun. We know it's wrong to take someone else's property or possessions without asking them. We learn that at a very early age. Just watch what happens when a 6-month-old child has a toy that they're playing with suddenly is taken away from them. What happens? There's crying, there's screaming, there's pandemonium. Or when a toddler is learning to talk What happens when an older sibling takes a toy from that child? What's one of the first words they learn? What's one of the first words that they say? Mine! One of the first words that my children learned was mine, but I don't recall teaching that to them. That child has become upset because they have an innate sense that what just happened to them was wrong. But where does that come from? The moral argument goes like this. Premise 1, there is a moral law. Premise 2, every law has a lawgiver. And the conclusion to that, therefore, there is a moral lawgiver. If the first two premises are true, then the conclusion that there is a moral lawgiver naturally follows. There are hundreds of thousands of laws, maybe millions on the books on the local, state, and national level, but where did those laws come from? There had to be an individual, or most likely a group of individuals, who decided to pass those laws. And then they sent them to the legislative bodies that actually voted on it and enacted those laws. They decided that the murderers, rapists, thieves, lawbreakers, swindlers, and crooks of every type must be fined, jailed, or somehow punished for breaking those laws. Even in our homes we impose certain laws, don't we? Things like lying, stealing, violating other family rules are not tolerated. Violation of those rules means some type of disciplinary punishment will be imposed by dad and or mom. Everywhere we turn, there are some types of laws or rules. There are rules for the classroom, rules for the workplace, rules for games and sports. Where do those laws, regulations, rules, etc. come from? They come from lawgivers. Let's start with the first premise. There is a moral law. The first premise is really the main point. Without it, the argument falls apart. How do we know there is an objective moral law? How do we know that? Terms like injustice or wrong imply that there is some objective standard to compare those terms to. Do we tie the belief that says acts such as torturing an innocent child, rape, murder, racism, and other such things are objectively immoral? By objectively, I mean acts that are immoral in a way that goes beyond our personal opinion or feelings. They are immoral no matter what my or my community's or my culture's opinion or feelings may be. There must be some objective moral standard. Without such a standard, there would be no moral difference between Adolf Hitler and Mother Teresa. In other words, without an absolute moral law to guide us toward right and wrong, then to say Hitler was wrong would merely be an opinion that has no real objective basis for others to agree or disagree with. Without an objective moral standard, there is no right and no wrong. But if Hitler was wrong based on an objective standard or moral law, then there must be a standard that rises above and beyond all of us. Now follow me with this. Those who do not believe in God object to such an assertion and say that a person does not need to acknowledge any kind of deity to understand, and I emphasize understand, moral right and wrong. In fact, it is not unusual to hear atheists can be good without God. I agree. Human beings do not need to believe in God to merely recognize or to merely understand moral duties or understand that moral values exist. The moral law argument has nothing to do with belief in God, and that has never been the argument of those who do believe in God. Instead, the argument is that in order to have any kind of firm, unshakable, unmovable grounding of an objective moral law, you need to have a greater, superior source of those laws or those values. A source not bound or influenced by imperfect, shifting human emotions or opinions. It cannot come from any temporal or natural source. That source must be perfect, wise, infinite, and supernatural, or beyond the natural. Rather, the argument does deal with grounding or substantiating objective morality. It all becomes a matter of opinion or personal preference if there's no objective moral law. If there is no objective moral law, who's right? Hitler or Mother Teresa? If there's no objective moral law, then Hitler's truth is no better or worse than Mother Teresa's truth. If God does not exist, then there can be no basis for objective morality. The point is that there must be a basis, some kind of standard that is outside of ourselves in order for there to be truly objective morality. People who deny God exists can still do good things, but only because God really does exist and has established what the standard of good is. God's existence is the only way that doing any kind of good at all is even possible to begin with. However, a problem arises from the fact that while human beings may recognize moral absolutes, they may understand that moral absolutes exist, they don't always practice them. But while the moral law does not describe what people may actually do, it does prescribe what they ought to do. Those are significant differences. Description versus prescription. Actually what they do versus what they ought to do. Many in the atheist community believe that a convincing case can be made for objective moral values and duties in the absence of God. One of the most prominent of these voices is Sam Harris. Mr. Harris has been a hotly vocal critic of religion, and particularly Christianity. His particular position for objective morality is grounded in the measurement of overall well-being and flourishing for the greatest amount of people. A couple of examples would be to evaluate the amount of flourishing and well-being that resulted from, say, organizing a government in a particular way, raising children in a particular manner, and contributing to certain charities, according to Harris. But I see problems with this, don't you? Who defines what well-being and flourishing is? And who decides what it looks like? How is it decided what successful well-being and flourishing is? How is that measured? What standard is used? That's all very subjective. Additionally, under Harris's position, what reason does anyone have to believe that their actions are objectively moral or objectively immoral? Who would be the judge of determining whether an action really added to human flourishing or actually detracted from it? If there is no absolute standard for human flourishing, who decides and how? In fact, the next generation in that type of community could very well decide that their parents' idea of well-being and flourishing is too oppressive or restrictive for them. And so they decide to cast their definition off in favor of a more popular and liberating idea of well-being and flourishing. So who decides? It varies. It could vary from generation to generation. And where does it end? You see, under this view, individuals have no absolute basis to refer to when making a moral judgment, when deciding what well-being or flourishing is. Or what if the Nazis, for example, killed everyone who disagreed with them and then brainwashed the rest of the world into thinking that their murderous actions toward the Jews resulted in their continued flourishing? What if Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Pol Pot did the same thing? These men are responsible for the murder of nearly 80 million people in the last century. 80 million people. If tens of millions of people are murdered, so presumably their country or culture or even the remaining portion of the world's population may flourish, who is the judge of whether this example of murder is objectively morally right or wrong? No one. Hitler believed the Nazis would flourish better in a world with no Jews. And certainly the Jews felt they would flourish better with no Nazis. But Hitler's idea of flourishing was much different than Mother Teresa's was. In the end, where there's no absolute objective morality, who's right? So there's the moral law, premise one. And now let's look at the second premise. Every law has a lawgiver. This is the part of the argument that atheists most strongly disagree with, because there is a direct link between the moral law and a moral lawgiver, God. The controversy is centered on this, the claim that it is not possible to have a moral law without a moral lawgiver. Atheists disagree with that. While most atheist philosophers are unwilling to deny the reality of morality, they also think that the moral law stands on its own without any need for further justification. In other words, one does not need to appeal to a moral lawgiver to acknowledge that there is indeed a moral standard that is independent of human decisions, will, or desires, and that helps us differentiate between good and evil. I could say that, for example, we have Mr. Socrates here. I could say all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. And that's all true, and not once did I appeal to God. That's simple logic. I could also say 2 + 2 = 4. Once again, I made no appeal to God. That's simple arithmetic. These are truths that are simply a part of reality, truths that we use every day without making an appeal to God. According to the atheist view, moral truths work the same way. They are just there as part of reality, and we understand and use them in the same way we understand and use truths of logic and mathematics. We do not need God to understand and apply these truths to our lives, so they say. However, if you go back and look carefully, you will notice that the argument has changed subtly from what is the source of the moral law or where does it come from to simply how we know about moral values. Even if it's true that we understand moral truths just like we understand logical and mathematical truths, it does not follow that morality is not based in God. But could it be the case that God actually made us in such a way that we are born with the capacity to understand laws of math and logic and morality immediately? Could it be that the child who cries, "That's not fair," or "mine," has an innate understanding of fairness implanted in their hearts by God? As a matter of fact, the scriptures teach that this is exactly what has happened, specifically with regard to the moral law. In Romans 2, verses 14 and 15, the Apostle Paul writes, "For when Gentiles do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them." You see, the law written on the hearts of every human is the moral law, or you may call it a conscience. It comes from a moral lawgiver who is above man. Atheism provides no objective basis for morality. They provide no objective basis for a meaning of life. And there's no hope. Without God, there would be no objective basis for morality, no reason to live life in a moral way. The moral argument states that all these things do exist, therefore, so does God. And this brings us to the conclusion. There is a moral law. Every law has a lawgiver. Therefore, there is a moral lawgiver. C.S. Lewis rightly said, "A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line." In other words, we can't say something is bad unless we know what good is. We can't know darkness without knowing what light is. Morality is grounded in God's nature, which is the reason why morality even exists at all and is absolute. Since we observe the existence of objective morals in our lives, it stands to reason that the moral law that was written on our hearts was given by a moral lawgiver, or God. The hard part for atheists is the idea of a personal God who has an intentional interest in humankind. And the argument that Lewis makes for the moral law in Mere Christianity is a powerful one. How is it that we human beings, amongst all of the animal kingdom, amongst all the species on earth, know what's right and what's wrong. In every culture, that innate knowledge of right and wrong, good and evil is there. Where did it come from? Morality comes from a God who made us in his image and who makes it possible for us to understand and apply morality to our lives. Christianity makes a practical, verifiable analysis of our spiritual condition. We have broken God's law. That's what sin is, breaking God's law. We are at odds with a system of morality that we did not invent, and we stand condemned. But Christianity does much more than that. It offers a solution to the human condition through the cross of Jesus. At the cross, God marvelously honors his justice while demonstrating his infinite love at the very same moment. And finally, the Word of God promises that we will one day be made morally perfect. At that point, morality will no longer be a subject of debate. We will just live it out the same way we breathe oxygen every day, only without the threat of air pollution, of course. Imagine that. We will one day live beyond right and wrong because God will have perfected us as moral beings. Without God, objective morality would not exist. Since we recognize the undeniable difference between God and evil in our daily lives, we can confidently state that God is the only foundation for an absolute moral law. What makes this argument so powerful is that everyone honestly seeking the truth can acknowledge the truth of these premises. There is an objective difference between right and wrong. Our experience tells us this. This objective truth leads us, it points us to the conclusion that someone is behind this moral law. With all of the moral evils that we witness around us every day in the news and other places, we know that the evil we witness is objectively evil. Murder, rape, genocide, infanticide, stealing, etc. are all objective evils. Most of us probably have never given much thought to this, but in a real sense, the existence of evil oddly affirms the existence of God, because we would never be able to acknowledge evil if it was not for the absolute moral law that is grounded in the moral nature of the one true lawgiver. This argument rings true with us more than many other arguments. If we reject the existence of an objective moral law given by a moral lawgiver, where does that leave us? It leaves us with no objective morality, no moral law, which would ultimately lead us to moral nihilism. Nihilism is the belief that there are no moral absolutes, that traditional moral values and beliefs are unfounded, and that existence is senseless and useless. While atheists and secular humanists try very hard to work around the argument for moral law, they cannot justify their godless position and make sense of morality at the same time. If we reject that there are first objective moral laws, and that all laws have a lawgiver, and finally that the moral law has a lawgiver, then we are on the path and will eventually reach not nirvana or utopia, but nihilism. God has embedded within each and every one of us, he has written on our hearts his moral law that makes sense out of how everyone acknowledges the difference between moral good and evil. Ultimately, that is why this argument is so powerful with so many people. To deny it is to accept moral nihilism. An honest search inside our own hearts will lead us to the conclusion that God is the only adequate explanation that makes the most sense of our experiential acknowledgement of objective moral values and duties. So friends, we've now examined the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, and the moral argument for the existence of God. The cosmological argument, we learned everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause for its existence, a cause beyond itself, a cause that all is infinite, all-powerful, and eternal. God. In the fine-tuning argument, we learn the surprising precision of nature's physical constants, 122 of them, and the early condition of the universe all had to be set to just the right set of values. They had to be finely tuned in order for life to exist at all. If some of those values were off by as little as 1 part to the millionth power, there would be no people, no planet, and no solar system. And in the moral law, we just learned the moral law exists. Every law must have a lawgiver. Therefore, the moral law has a lawgiver who is God. While none of these arguments alone provide us with direct evidence proving with 100% certainty of the existence of God, all of them together do provide us with significant circumstantial evidence that points us in the direction of the existence of God. And we're not looking for the most possible explanation, we're looking for the most reasonable explanation, and I think the arguments that have been presented are very reasonable. If we were in a court of law at this point, the judge would direct the jury based on the evidence. You must decide beyond any reasonable doubt, not beyond the shadow of a doubt. That's not how cases are decided. They're decided on a beyond a reasonable doubt basis. So what's your decision? How would you rule? You're the judge. Maybe you're not sure yet. If that's so, go back and watch the first 4 episodes. Also, go to my resources and links page at equip412.com and see if there's anything there that might be able to help you explore this topic further. As always, I sincerely thank you for watching this episode today. I hope it's helping you, and I pray you'll continue on with us for further episodes. As always, please keep your comments courteous and respectful. But do, please comment. And don't forget to join us for the next episode of Equip 412. I'll be starting a new series titled, Is Jesus for Real? I hope you'll join me. Until next time, be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. Friends, may God truly bless you this week. I pray I'll see you again soon.